Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay, here to sad news to report, unfortunately, on the death of legendary actor Richard Roundtree. Now, for those that don't know who Richard Roundtree is, obviously it's in the title, but he was a very prolific actor, especially in the 1970s. In the 1971 film directed by Gordon Parks, starring him, Richard Roundtree, Shaft. And Shaft, along with Sweet Sweet Badass Song, another movie directed by Melvin Van Peebles, the father of actor Mario Van Peebles, considered by film historians the start of what is known as the black exploitation era of films, which roughly lasted throughout the 1970s. These were films specifically targeted towards a black audience about the urban environment, about street crime, about the corrupt system of oppression. And they were considered to be, well, at least sweet, sweetback badass song, and Shaft to some degree. Even though Shaft was more of a mainstream hit with Isaac Hayes on the soundtrack, uh, and really spawning a bunch of sequels like such as Shaft Goes to Africa, right? But these films were considered um, a chance for black directors and black writers, at least initially, to tell their own stories. Because before that, prior to that time in Hollywood, we talked about the Sidney Poitiers, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner type of movies, um, uh, those types of films, that were specific, and even before that, prior to that, like Gone with the Wind, Hattie McDaniel's role, those type of, and going all the way back to the beginning of film history with Birth of a Nation, these stories were told uh, by white directors and white writers that often put African Americans in a more demeaning position. But by the time the 70s rolled around with the influence of the Black Power movement, specifically the Black Panthers, because Black Panthers had given their endorsement to Melvin Van Peebles with uh, the sweet, sweet, sweetback badass song, and to Shaft. This was a chance to finally, as just as the clothing brand FUBU was for us by us, for black fashion designers, this was a chance for black writers and black directors to be able to tell specifically black stories with an all black cast. For those that don't know, Shaft, although a fictionalized story, was kind of, some of the villains in Shaft were kind of based on real life organized crime, underground type figures within Harlem. I think there's a character based on Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, who was a famous uh, gangster in Harlem from the 1930s till his death in the late 1960s. You know what I mean? So, and then of course, as with every other trend, as with the trend in the 90s with the we call the hood movies, Jason's lyrics, starting with Boys in the Hood with John Singleton in 1991. As with that, once Hollywood gets a hold of these specific trends, we saw it with the Tyler Perry movies in the 2000s. Once they get a hold of this type of trend, just like anything else, they start to copy it and it becomes oversaturated and overexposed. And by the time we get around to, say, the late 70s, it just becomes a caricature. Whereas it was a form of cinematic resistance at one point, it, it becomes oversaturated and becomes just more funny stuff. So by the time we get around to say Dolomite, right, it's more comedic, than serious, and it's more um, played for laughs. Just the same thing happened with other cult types of movies that were targeted to specific audiences too. Like, for example, sci-fi movies. Sci-fi movies in the 50s, you know, were all the rage. But you know, by the time we get around to say those in the early '60s, they're considered comical stuff. But they come back around, by 1977, and again, as it pertains to Richard Roundtree, by the time we're dealing with black exploitation films, Hollywood is undergoing a change as well. Because remember, in the early '70s, by the late '60s, with Easy Rider, we're moving away from the Hollywood studio system that had always existed from the beginning of Hollywood in the 1920s and 30s to a more independent, director-driven medium. That's when these directors become popular. When Francis Ford Coppola becomes popular, right? When George Lucas becomes popular, when Steven Spielberg becomes popular, when John Carpenter becomes popular, and that's in the other types of subgenres as well, horror movies and sci-fi movies. So it's no different with the urban genre, you know, um, marketed towards an African American audience. For the first time ever, directors, and specifically black directors, and specifically Gordon Parks in this case. Gordon Parks is famous. Well, when I think of Gordon Parks, the photo that I think of is from one of the Savior's Days. For those that don't know what Savior's Day is the February, a celebration, is the biggest holiday within the sect of Islam known as the Nation of Islam. It's their biggest holiday, so it's like their version of the biggest gathering, and it celebrates. I think it takes place on February 26th, I believe, of every year, and it celebrates the birthday of the founder, Master Farad Muhammad, who is the founder, of course, of the Nation of Islam. So anyway, Gordon Parks took this famous photo of the women of the Nation of Islam, the sisters of the Nation of Islam, and that's the photo that I associate him with. Of course, he's known for other photos, but he was a famous photographer within the African American community. And when he did, in 1971, he decided to make his own film. Take it from still photography to um, movies. Yes, I was correct in saying that it actually is February the 26th, the annual Savior's Day convention. So anyway, Gordon Parks, like I said, took these photos of slices of Black lives. It wasn't only that particular photo, and it wasn't only covering members of the Nation of Islam, but other other types of photos within um, the Harlem community and within Black society. But he decided to take it from still photos to um, to movies, and this is what he produced. One of the greatest cinematic workings, and like I've heard people say with Richard Roundtree, he was the first black superhero. This time, there weren't that many superhero movies to begin with. I mean, you didn't have the first Superman movie didn't come out really till 1978 um, with Richard Donner's Christopher Reeve movie, and but you did have George Reeves. You did have his show in the Superman short, but you didn't have anything for a black audience. So before Black Panther, before um, Nick Cage, you know, you had Shaft, this cool, slick talking, really hip type cop who was fighting crime and fighting it on his own terms. Because we talked about it before, how in the post Vietnam, well, this wasn't even 71, wasn't even really post Vietnam, but in the post basically breakdown of American society, you know, in the urban environments, you had nothing but urban jungles, as it were, nothing but urban decay. So you have a guy like Shaft coming around who is a bad mother. Shut your mouth. You know what I mean? Coming around and playing and being a cop trying to serve law, order, and justice, basically, in a similar way that Batman would have in the break with the breakdown of society, during the Great Depression. You know, here you have the era of malaise, the era of, well, pre Watergate, but there's a lack of trust within authority because of how somebody like President Johnson had dropped the ball with Vietnam, the chaos and division that was produced from the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement of the mid to late 60s. And if you're going to have a cop serve law, order, and justice, he has to do it his way. And he has to do it accustomed to the way that society is. Richard Roundtree, like I said, we're going to star in other spin-offs of Shaft. Shaft was kind of this stock character similar to like Ernest or similar to like a Medea, but a serious version put in these different situations. And he would spawn a bunch of other black exploitation movies like Pam Grier's The Original Foxy Brown, things like that. But he would also star in the landmark series Roots, which was in the late uh, the uh, in the 1970s as well, telling the story, the family lineage, the family saga of Alex Haley, the writer, who actually traced his family roots all the way back to Gambia, to an ancestor in Gambia, West Africa, who was captured by slave traders, as he was making a drum. Kufere actually is the city in Gambia, West Africa. The character of Kunta Kinte, the ancestor of Alex Haley. And Alex Haley then goes through Kunta Kinte's descendants, played by John Amos, the father on the TV show Good Times. The adult version, the child version of Kunta Kinte, of course, played by Reading Rainbow / Star Trek star LeVar Burton. And it takes us all the way through slavery, through the Civil War, through Reconstruction, basically all of African American history leading up to that point. So and it was a miniseries on TV, so it was everyone had access to it, and this was This miniseries was really the first time ever that American audiences, particularly white American audiences who like to be obtuse and just deny reality and deny how brutal slavery, the slave trade, and the treatment of African Americans, the discrimination that African Americans had to endure, even post slavery, they like to deny that. Here they were confronted with the brutal realities of what the African American experience is were through the eyes of this one family, Alex Haley's family. So Richard Roundtree played a role in that. Um, he also his last role was in Mary Jane, a role with Gabrielle Union, which is another crime show similar to uh, Shaft. Yeah, he was in a lot of things. But rest in peace to him and condolences to his family. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Peace. Love you guys. And I think what Richard Roundtree's enduring legacy was that he was a symbol of black masculinity at a time when characters were black characters especially were demasculated, because the idea of demasculated black men was something that was a theme in movies going all the way back to Birth of a Nation. I mean, who is again the D.W. Griffin movie made in 1915 that inspired the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan, the second iteration of the Ku Klux Klan, and a bunch of racism that we talked about before in the last video. And so Shaft was kind of reversing that. Shaft was kind of showing, okay, here's a black man who's in charge. Here's a black man who's confident. Here's a black man who ain't gonna take no shit. As the moniker said, he's a bad mother. Shut your mouth. He's a bad motherfucker, right? Reversing decades and decades of this image of black men as these docile, sissified, uh, could take anything willing slave. No. Now, now Shaft was going to show a strong black man, a black man who's going to fight against criminals, fight against these villains that are terrorizing his community, while at the same time bucking it at the system in the same way that in real life men like Huey Newton were doing, men like Eldridge Cleaver were doing, men like Malcolm X, right? These real black militant types were doing up until that point, and embody a black ethos of resistance, not a passive resistance either, but an active, hardcore resistance. Peace.